In January of 27 BC, the most powerful man in the world walked into the Roman Senate and announced he was quitting. He said he was tired. He said his work was done. He said Rome was safe now, and he was going home. The senators stared at him. Some wept, some panicked. A few knew exactly what was happening and said nothing. Because Octavian was not quitting, he was making his final move. And by the time anyone understood it clearly enough to resist, it was already too late. This is the story of how one man dismantled a 500-year-old republic, installed himself as the permanent ruler of the known world, and made the people he had just conquered applaud him for it. No tyrant's title, no crown, no declaration of power, just a performance so precise, so sustained, so ruthlessly intelligent that Rome would spend the next 4 centuries calling the system he built a republic, while living under the rule of emperors who inherited his throne. His name was Augustus. He never called himself emperor. That was the genius of it. To understand what Augustus did, you have to understand what Rome was when he arrived. Not the Rome of marble and legend, the real Rome. A city that had been bleeding for 100 years. The Roman Republic was supposed to be the greatest political invention in history. 2 consuls elected every year, each able to veto the other. A senate of hundreds to debate and check them. No single man could hold too much power for too long. It was designed, deliberately, to prevent exactly what was about to happen. It failed, slowly. Then all at once. Marius, Sulla, Pompey. One by one, Rome's generals had discovered the system's fatal weakness. It had no answer for a man who simply refused to obey it. Sulla marched on Rome twice. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The lesson was always the same. In the Roman Republic, the man with the most soldiers made the law. The Senate could pass resolutions. It could not stop legions. By 44 BC, the year Caesar died, Rome was exhausted. Farms burned across Italy. The treasury had been looted and restocked and looted again. A generation of young men had grown up knowing nothing but civil war. The Senate still met. It still argued. But it had been packed, bypassed, and terrified into submission so many times that it no longer functioned as a check on anything. It functioned as a theater, a stage set for men who had already made their decisions elsewhere. What Rome needed was peace. What Rome feared was a king. This was the trap Augustus had to walk through, and he walked through it in a way no one had ever thought to try. Julius Caesar made one error. Not cruelty, he was often merciful. Not incompetence, he was brilliant. His error was simpler and more human than either. He made powerful men feel like extras in someone else's story. Caesar sat on a golden throne in the Senate. A throne, whatever he called it. He put his own face on Roman coins while he was still alive. He named a month after himself. He held the dictatorship not for a temporary emergency, as tradition demanded, but permanently, without end. And when senators offered him a crown, 3 times, publicly, in the forum, he refused it. But the refusal convinced no one. It was theater, and everyone knew it was theater. Caesar was rubbing their faces in his own power, and he was smiling while he did it. The senators who killed him were not idealists. They were not defenders of some sacred principle. Most of them had served Caesar loyally. Many had accepted his pardons, his promotions, his money. They killed him because of a feeling, a specific, corrosive feeling that has driven men to violence throughout history. The feeling of being made irrelevant, of watching one man rewrite every rule while you sit in your gilded seat and clap. 23 of them walked into Pompey's theater on the Ides of March, 44 BC, with daggers under their togas. Caesar died at the foot of a statue of his old enemy Pompey, of all the bitter ironies, with 23 wounds. The liberators, as they called themselves, ran into the streets shouting about freedom. Rome stood still, and then the city exploded. Octavian was 18 years old, studying in what is now Albania, when the news reached him. He was Caesar's great-nephew. He had been named Caesar's son and heir in a will sealed years earlier. He read the dispatches carefully. He thought for what the sources suggest was a very long time. Then he came home. What he understood, what he would spend the next 50 years proving he had understood, was not that Caesar had been too powerful. Caesar had been the most powerful man in Rome, and it had not saved him. What Octavian understood was that Caesar had been too visible, too obvious, too willing to make his power the first thing anyone saw when they looked at him. The senators killed Caesar not because he was a tyrant, but because the performance of his tyranny was transparent. And transparency, for men who still remembered what dignity felt like, was the most unforgivable thing of all. Octavian filed that lesson away. He would never forget it. When Octavian arrived in Rome in 44 BC, no serious person took him seriously. He was 18, slight, frequently sick. Mark Antony, Caesar's top general, the man who had just delivered Caesar's funeral oration and set Rome on fire with grief and fury, looked at this pale teenager and dismissed him openly. That was Antony's first mistake. It would not be his last. What Antony had missed was the weight of a name. Octavian was now, by law and will, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He was Caesar's son. And in a Rome that had just heard Antony read Caesar's will aloud in the Forum, that Caesar had left every Roman citizen 75 drachmas from his personal fortune. In that Rome, being Caesar's heir was not a title. It was a weapon. Octavian used it without mercy. He recruited Caesar's veterans and paid them from Caesar's own war chest. He bought loyalty the way Rome always bought it. Money now, more money later. Within months, a teenager with no military record had raised a private army. The Senate, which had been maneuvering to use him against Antony, suddenly realized they were dealing with something they had not planned for. Then came the moment that tells you everything about who Octavian was. The Senate, panicking, tried to take his army away. Octavian's soldiers responded by demanding he march on Rome and seize the consulship by force. He was 20 years old. He marched. He got what he wanted. Then he switched sides. He allied with Antony, the man who had been his enemy, and with Lepidus, the third powerful general. Together they formed the second triumvirate. And their first official act, the first thing this legal body did with the power of the Roman state behind it, was to publish the Proscriptions. Let that word sit for a moment. 300 senators, 2,000 knights, names posted in the Forum with bounties attached. Kill them and collect your reward. Shelter them and die with them. Property seized, families destroyed, heads delivered for cash. It was not justice. It was organized extermination, and Octavian was not dragged into it reluctantly. He participated fully, with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that incomplete destruction always comes back to haunt you. The ancient sources that were written under later emperors who owed their legitimacy to Augustus's memory try to soften this. They say he argued against certain names. He tried to limit the killing. None of the more hostile sources confirm any of this. The weight of evidence is simpler and darker. All three men, Octavian, Antony, Lepidus, were equally guilty. The Proscriptions were a partnership, a blood compact that bound them to each other through shared crime as much as shared ambition. Among the dead was Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, 63 years old, the greatest voice the Roman Republic had ever produced. A man who had spent his entire career defending Roman law, Roman tradition, the idea that the Republic was worth preserving. Soldiers caught him near his villa, trying to reach the sea by litter. He had been betrayed by a local shoemaker. He offered his neck. The soldier who killed him had once been his client in court. His head and his hands were cut off. They were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, the very platform where he had delivered the speeches that had made him famous. Antony's wife reportedly stabbed the dead tongue with her hairpin. Whether or not that detail is true, no one seems to have found it unbelievable. The Republic died in those weeks, not as a symbol, as a fact. The institutions Cicero had given his life to were murdered by the men who would spend the next decades claiming to restore them. Octavian knew exactly what he had done. He would spend the rest of his life ensuring Rome forgot it. He was, in this as in everything, extraordinarily successful. By 36 BC, two men remained. Octavian held the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain, Africa. Mark Antony held the East, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and through his alliance with Cleopatra, the seventh of Egypt, the enormous wealth of the Nile. The Mediterranean world was split between them. Both men knew it could not stay that way. One of them was going to die. What followed was not simply a military buildup. It was a propaganda war. And this is where Octavian revealed the talent that mattered most. Antony had made himself vulnerable in ways he may not have fully understood. He had a Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, and had essentially abandoned her, spending his time in Alexandria with Cleopatra. In Egypt, he and Cleopatra had staged a ceremony the Romans called the Donations of Alexandria, publicly distributing Roman territories to their children together, like foreign royalty. Antony had appeared in public, dressed as the god Dionysus. He was living, in Roman eyes, like an Eastern king, soft, seduced, no longer quite Roman at all. Octavian took every one of these facts and weaponized them. The message he sent to Rome was surgical. Antony is no longer one of us. He has surrendered himself to a foreign queen. He plans to move the capital to Alexandria. His will, Octavian had somehow obtained it from the temple of the Vestal Virgins, where Roman wills were kept sealed, in a move that was by any measure an act of religious desecration. His will showed that Antony intended to be buried in Egypt, not in Roman soil. Reading that will aloud in the Senate was a violation of everything Roman law and Roman religion held sacred. Wills were private. They were inviolable before death. Breaking the seal was sacrilege. Octavian read it anyway, and he dared anyone in that chamber to say so. Then he declared war. Not on Antony, a Roman citizen, which would have made this another civil war. He declared war on Cleopatra, a foreign enemy, a foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman general and now threatened Rome's dignity. The Senate voted for it. Rome, which had been exhausted unto death by decades of Romans killing Romans, found something it could call enthusiasm. This was different. This was righteous. It was, of course, the same war it had always been. Octavian had simply given it a better story. The final confrontation came at Actium on the western coast of Greece, September 2nd, 31 BC. Antony had arrived with what should have been an overwhelming force, 100,000 soldiers on land, nearly 500 warships on the water. Cleopatra beside him with 60 Egyptian vessels and the treasury that had funded the entire campaign. By any measure of raw strength, Antony had the advantage. Then Agrippa went to work. Marcus Agrippa was the military genius of this era, the man who actually won Octavian's wars, on water and on land, while Octavian managed the politics. Octavian understood this about himself clearly enough to never pretend otherwise in private. He deployed Agrippa the way a chess player deploys his strongest piece, completely, without ego, and at exactly the right moment. Agrippa did not seek a decisive battle. He went after Antony's supply lines. He struck first at Methone, a critical port on Antony's supply chain back to Egypt, killed its commander, and cut the thread. Then he began a relentless campaign of hit-and-run raids across every route Antony depended on. He was never where Antony's fleet could pin him down. He was always where Antony's supply ships were most vulnerable. Week after week, the pressure mounted. The effect inside Antony's camp was slow, then catastrophic. 100,000 men need an enormous amount of food. When Agrippa cut the supply lines, those men began to starve. Disease came next, malaria creeping out of the nearby marshes, then desertion, at first a trickle, then a river. Allied kings who had sworn loyalty to Antony began quietly calculating their futures and making different arrangements. By the time September came, Antony's position was not weakened. It was destroyed. He burned the ships he couldn't man. He loaded the treasury onto Cleopatra's vessels. He had no good options left, only less bad ones. On the morning of September 2nd, the two fleets faced each other across the bay. For nearly 6 hours, nothing moved. Both sides waited for the other to blink. Finally, Antony advanced, and the battle began in earnest. Ships ramming, catapults firing, men burning and drowning in the water. Neither side could break the other. Then Cleopatra's 60 ships, which had not engaged at all, suddenly drove through a gap in the line and sailed for open sea. Antony saw it. He transferred to a smaller vessel, and he followed her. What happened next on the ships he left behind was the death of an era. Antony's commanders fought on for hours, some of them burning their own vessels to keep them from being captured. Men trapped below decks as smoke filled the hulls. By 8 in the evening it was over. Most of the fleet was gone. The war ground on for another year, but everyone who understood these things knew it had ended at Actium. Antony died in Alexandria on a false report that Cleopatra had already killed herself. He fell on his own sword and botched it, and bled out slowly. A wretched end for a man who had once commanded half the world. Cleopatra survived him long enough to understand what Octavian intended, that she would be paraded through Rome in chains in his triumph. The foreign queen displayed for the crowd's contempt, and she chose to die instead. She died as a queen. She was the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt. Octavian stood in Alexandria and looked at the tomb of Alexander the Great. He was 32 years old. Alexander had been 32 when he died, master of an empire stretching from Greece to India. Octavian had surpassed him. He just couldn't say so. Here is what no one tells you about total victory. Total victory is a trap. Every man who had achieved it in Rome had discovered this. Sulla had seized absolute power, and within a year, exhausted, gave it back and died. Caesar had seized absolute power and been killed for it. The pattern was almost mechanical. The moment you accumulated enough strength to be safe from rivals, you had accumulated enough strength to make the Senate fear you. And the Senate, when it feared you, started holding private meetings and sharpening things. Octavian understood this. He had spent 14 years studying it. He returned to Rome in 29 BC and performed humility with the same precision he had once performed war. He held 3 consecutive triumphs over 3 days, one for Dalmatia, one for Actium, one for Egypt, and carefully framed not one of them as a victory over fellow Romans. He lavished money on the city. He settled 80,000 veterans on land he purchased, not seized. He closed the doors of the Temple of Janus, a ceremony performed only when Rome was at peace, for only the 3rd time in 500 years of history. Then he quietly trimmed the Senate. 200 senators were expelled or pressured out. The ones who remained owed their positions to him. He melted down the silver statues that had been cast in his likeness. He paid to restore 82 temples at his own expense. He was careful, always, to be seen refusing honors that were too extravagant, making a show of his modesty in a room where everyone understood that the man demonstrating modesty had more power than any Roman who had ever lived. The performance was building toward something. He was not done. On January 13th, 27 BC, Octavian walked into the Senate and gave the most important speech in the history of Roman politics. He did not begin with modesty. He began by describing his power in precise detail. The legions under his command, the provinces he governed, the treasury he controlled, the network of obligation and loyalty that extended from the Atlantic coast to the edge of Parthia. He was, he stated plainly, more powerful than Pompey, more powerful than Caesar, more powerful than anyone who had ever held Roman citizenship. He acknowledged this completely. And then he said he was giving it all up. Every province, every army, every special power the Senate had voted him since Actium, all of it. He was done. He had avenged Caesar's murder. He had healed the civil wars. Rome was safe. He was going home. The Senate went silent. Then it erupted. What followed was not spontaneous. It had been choreographed, though executed so perfectly that historians have argued for 2,000 years about how much of it was scripted and how much was real. Some senators were genuinely horrified. An Octavian outside the system, a private citizen with 50,000 loyal veterans scattered across Italy, was more dangerous than one inside it. Some senators had genuinely come to believe that Rome needed him, and some simply knew their lines. The appeals began. Octavian refused. More senators pleaded. He refused again. More still. He refused a 3rd time. Then, in stages, with visible reluctance and what appeared to be genuine anguish, he allowed himself to be persuaded to stay. He would not abandon Rome. He could not. Not when Rome needed him. He would stay. But only because Rome asked it of him. Not for himself. Of course not for himself. The settlement that followed was the work of a man who had been planning it for years. Octavian would hold one of the 2 consulships annually, the legal authority to speak in the Senate and convene it. He would govern for a 10-year term a consolidated province consisting of Hispania, Gaul, Cilicia, Syria, and Egypt, which happened by remarkable coincidence to contain the majority of Rome's legions. 20 of the 27 legions in the empire fell under his direct command. The Senate would govern the remaining provinces, the peaceful interior ones, with their 6 legions, their trade routes, their calm. He was also given a new title. He had considered Romulus, the founder of Rome, a name that announced what he was doing. He decided it was too obvious, too direct, too honest. Instead, he chose a word with no political precedent: Augustus. From the Latin for sacred, revered, blessed by the gods. Not king, not emperor, not ruler, not even quite leader, the revered one. A title that sounded like a religious honorific rather than a claim to power. He took it, and from that day forward, he was Augustus. Viewed from the outside, from the perspective of any senator who needed to believe it, the Republic had been restored. The Senate still deliberated. Elections still happened. Laws were still passed through the traditional process. Augustus held the consulship the way distinguished Romans always had. His provincial authority was broad, but it had been legally voted him by the Senate. Everything was proper. Everything was constitutional. The Roman Empire had begun. Its founder had simply neglected to announce it. So how do you rule everything while appearing to rule nothing? 3 pillars, each one invisible, each one load-bearing. The first was military. Roman soldiers had sworn oaths to their generals rather than to the state since the days of Marius. A structural flaw so old and so deep that no reformer had ever managed to fix it. Augustus did not try to fix it. He built on it. Every legionary in the empire swore his oath personally to Augustus. Augustus paid their wages from his personal treasury, stocked with the wealth of Egypt, which flowed to him like a river with no downstream. Augustus guaranteed their land grants when they retired. The Roman army was, in every practical sense, a private force. It simply happened to be large enough to be the only force that mattered. The second pillar was geography. Under the settlement, the Senate governed the peaceful interior provinces. Wealthy, stable, no armies required. Augustus governed the frontier provinces, where the enemies were, where the legions were stationed, where everything that mattered was decided. In any confrontation between a senatorial governor with administrative authority and Augustus with 20 legions at his personal command, the outcome was not a question worth asking. The third pillar was auctoritas, the untranslatable Roman word for prestige, the accumulated moral weight of a man's public record. Caesar had possessed enormous auctoritas, and it had not saved him, because Caesar's auctoritas had been built on visible domination. Augustus built his on something different. He restored 82 temples. He revived ancient religious rituals that had lapsed. He commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid, an epic poem that placed Rome's origins in divine providence and Augustus's rise as the fulfillment of a cosmic plan centuries in the making. He patronized Horace, who wrote odes of the new Golden Age, peace after chaos, order after blood. He supported Livy's great history of Rome, which told the story of the Republic as a glorious prologue to what had now arrived. The greatest literary talent of the age was not hostile to the regime. It was the regime's instrument, and then he built. He had found Rome a city of brick, he said, and left it a city of marble. This was not vanity. Marble temples do not speak of a man's ego. They speak of the gods. They speak of permanence. They speak of a civilization restored and elevated. Every building was an argument. Every column was a sentence in the case Augustus was making to everyone who walked through the city. What you see now is what Rome was always meant to become. I did not break your republic. I completed it. In one of the most revealing phrases of the era, Romans sometimes described the political system as a shadow puppet theater. It moved like a republic. It spoke like a republic. It had the correct shape. Behind the screen, operating every lever, were a single pair of hands. Augustus was very careful that no one in the front rows ever looked behind the screen. The system was not perfect. In 24 BC, 4 years after the first settlement, it nearly cracked open. A governor named Marcus Primus went on trial for launching an unauthorized war against a neighboring kingdom. Routine case. But in his defense, Primus made a claim that stopped the trial cold. He said Augustus had ordered the attack, that Augustus had personally directed military action in a province he had no legal authority over. Augustus denied it. Primus was convicted of treason. Case closed. But the damage was done. The accusation had put something unspeakable into words, that Augustus was secretly directing events across the entire empire, including the parts the Senate believed it governed. If that were true, the restored republic was not a restoration at all. It was a set decoration. Publicly, Augustus had won the argument. Privately, he understood that the fiction had developed a crack, and cracks spread. Shortly after the trial, several of the men who had led the prosecution against Primus were implicated in a conspiracy against Augustus's life. They were executed. Whether the conspiracy was real or invented, its timing was impeccable. Augustus sat with the lesson of it for a year. Then, in 23 BC, he acted. He resigned the consulship. Publicly, this looked like a concession. He was giving up one of the two highest offices in Rome, sharing power, demonstrating, again, his famous modesty. The senators who wanted to believe this were welcome to. What Augustus received in exchange was far more than he surrendered. His authority over other governors was expanded and formalized. He was now legally superior to every governor in every province, including those the Senate nominally controlled. His powers extended inside Rome's sacred boundary for the first time. And then there was the new title, Tribunicia Potestas, Tribunician power, for life. The tribune of the plebs had always been a junior office. Its historical function was to protect ordinary Romans from the arbitrary power of the aristocracy. A tribune could veto any law. More importantly, a tribune's person was legally inviolable, sacrosanct, untouchable, protected by Roman religion itself. Any man who harmed a tribune was outside the law. Augustus now held this office, permanently. He could veto any legislation in Rome. He could not be legally touched. And he was not presenting himself as a consul or a general or a governor. He was presenting himself as the eternal protector of the Roman people against the misuse of power. He had just made himself constitutionally immune to assassination, while framing it as an act of humble public service. It was the most elegant move of his career, and no one in Rome had a clean way to argue against it. There was one problem Augustus could never fully solve, one crack in the architecture that never closed. Succession. Republics solve succession easily. New magistrates are elected every year. The system continues because the rules apply to everyone equally, regardless of who holds office. But Augustus had not built a republic. He had built a system that existed entirely around one man's particular, personal accumulation of power, trust, and obligation. And that accumulation was not transferable by election. It had to be constructed, quietly, over years, through adoption, through marriage, through the careful positioning of one person after another, in ways that could not be publicly acknowledged, because acknowledging them meant admitting the system was a hereditary monarchy, which it was. This was the paradox at the heart of everything. He could not name an heir without becoming an emperor. He could not prepare a succession without revealing that the republic was theater. So he did both, indirectly, through proxies and relationships and careful legal maneuvering, while maintaining publicly that none of it was happening. And history, as if to punish him for the dishonesty, killed his chosen heirs one by one. His nephew Marcellus, charming and popular, the first great hope, dead in 23 BC, the same year as the crisis with Primus, likely in the epidemic that nearly took Augustus himself. His daughter Julia was married to Agrippa, the general, the real architect of Octavian's military victories, a man so indispensable that Augustus bound him to the family with every tie available. They had 5 children. Then Agrippa died in 12 BC. Julia, now a widow and increasingly a political inconvenience, was exiled in 2 BC on charges of adultery. That may have been true, or may have been the mechanism Augustus used to remove a woman who had become too independent, too conspicuous, too dangerous. His grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, formally adopted as sons and groomed as the next generation of heirs, died within 2 years of each other. Lucius in AD 2, Gaius in AD 4. Every one of these deaths was also a small political crisis. Everyone required a new improvisation, a new arrangement, a new piece of family architecture constructed under the pretense that nothing was being arranged. What was left, after all the deaths and all the exiles, was Tiberius. Tiberius was his stepson, cold, competent, unhappy, a gifted soldier who had served Rome brilliantly. A man who had been forced into a marriage with Julia that he despised, having been compelled to divorce a wife he loved, who had eventually retreated to voluntary exile on the island of Rhodes. Whether from genuine depression, political protest, or both, the sources disagree. He was not who Augustus would have chosen. He was simply what remained. In AD 4, Augustus formally adopted him. Neither man concealed his ambivalence. Tiberius's reported words at the ceremony were, "I am doing this for Rome, not for myself." Augustus's reply acknowledged, with characteristic precision, that he understood exactly what Tiberius meant by that distinction. The system required an heir. An heir required a monarch. A monarch required admitting that the 500 years of the Republic were over. So both men said none of these things explicitly, while arranging every detail of a royal succession in a republic that officially did not exist. In AD 9, Rome walked into a trap. Publius Quinctilius Varus commanded 3 legions in the newly pacified territories east of the Rhine. He was an experienced administrator. He had governed Syria competently. But he had made the kind of mistake that experienced men make when they have been successful for too long. He trusted a man he should not have trusted. Arminius was a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman auxiliary forces, held Roman citizenship, spoken Latin, studied Roman military doctrine from the inside. He had learned exactly how Roman legions moved, how they formed, where they were vulnerable. He had watched Rome win its wars for years. He had been decorated for his service. Then he went home, and he built a coalition. Arminius invited Varus to march his 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, through the Teutoburg forest, to suppress what Arminius described as a local uprising. The uprising was fictional. The march was a corridor into a kill zone. Dense forest, narrow trails, no room for the disciplined formations that made Roman legions nearly unbeatable in open ground. No space for cavalry, no angles of fire for artillery. The ambush lasted 3 days. When it was over, 17,000 Roman soldiers were dead. Legionaries, officers, support staff, all of them. Varus, understanding that there was no honorable exit from what had happened, fell on his own sword. The 3 legions' sacred eagle standards, the most honored objects in Roman military culture, the symbol of each unit's identity and continuity, were captured. Rome would not recover some of them for decades. The news arrived in Rome in stages, each messenger bringing something worse than the last. Augustus, 71 years old and failing health, wandered the corridors of his palace at night for weeks. His household staff reported hearing him, alone in the dark, striking his head against the walls. Varus, give me back my legions. He never replaced those 3 units. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never reassigned to new formations. Not a superstition, a wound. The Rhine became the permanent northern frontier of the empire. The dream of a Roman Germany died in the Teutoburg forest, and yet the system held. This is the thing that has to be understood about what Augustus built. It was designed to survive disasters. The loss of 17,000 soldiers, catastrophic by any measure, did not shake the government, did not trigger a succession crisis, did not invite rebellion. The machine absorbed the blow and kept moving, because it was built not on conquest or momentum, but on permanence, on institutions and obligations and a web of loyalty so carefully constructed that it was larger than any one calamity could unravel. Augustus had built something that could outlast him. He was beginning to understand what that meant. Augustus died in August of AD 14. He was 75 years old, an extraordinary age in a world where 50 was considered long-lived, in a political system that had been killing ambitious men in the prime of their careers for 100 years before he figured out how to survive it. He had been the central figure in Roman politics for 44 years. He had outlived every rival, every ally, every enemy, every friend. The generation that remembered the Republic, that had lived under real elections, real senatorial debate, real checks on individual power, was dead. The generation that came of age under Augustus knew only the Principate. They called it a republic because it had always been called a republic. They voted in elections that had always been managed. They debated in a Senate whose debates had always been decided in advance. They were not deceived. They simply had no other reference point. The system Augustus had built had become the only reality they knew. He died at Nola, traveling with Tiberius, in what many took as a final act of succession management, ensuring that the transfer of power would have no gap for enemies to exploit. His wife Livia was with him. His last words, as reported by the historian Suetonius, had the quality of something either perfectly authentic or perfectly constructed. He called the men around his deathbed closer. He asked whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life. The Latin word for the form of theater he used, mime, meant performance in which actors took on roles not their own, in which the performance itself was the entire substance of the art. If you found it satisfactory, he reportedly said, then show your appreciation with applause as I exit. Whether he said it or not, it is too fitting to be dismissed. His entire reign was a performance, the most sustained, the most technically accomplished, the most consequential performance in the history of Western politics. And like all great performances, its genius lay in making the audience forget they were watching one. The Senate voted him divine honors. He became Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus. His month, Sextilis, was renamed August. It is still August. Tiberius took power. There was no civil war. The machinery of succession that Augustus had spent decades constructing while publicly denying its existence worked exactly as designed, at the exact moment it was most needed. The Principate continued. Caligula came and went. Claudius, Nero, the year of the 4 emperors, the Flavians, the 5 good emperors, Constantine. 400 years after Augustus died at Nola, emperors were still accumulating the same offices he had assembled, still calling themselves Augustus. still governing through forms that looked like a republic on the surface and were entirely personal underneath. He had built something that outlasted not just his enemies and his allies and his dynasty. He had outlasted his civilization's memory of a world before it. Here is the question that matters. Not whether Augustus was good or bad. Historians have argued that in good faith for 2,000 years, and will argue it for 2,000 more. The question is, why did it work? Caesar had armies. Caesar had money. Caesar had popular support and the greatest military record of his generation. Caesar had everything that Augustus had, in larger quantities, with more experience behind it. Caesar was stabbed 23 times in a theater by men who had accepted his pardons. Augustus died in bed at 75, surrounded by his family, mourned by a city that could no longer imagine the world without him. The difference was not power. The difference was the performance of power. Caesar put his dominance on display. He demanded acknowledgement of it in the Senate chamber and in the streets and in the forum. He made powerful men watch him occupy every role they had ever imagined for themselves. He made them irrelevant and made sure they felt it. And when those men finally understood that the republic they had served was not coming back, they reached for knives. Augustus gave them a role, a stage, the experience day after day of participating in something that felt like a republic. Elections, debates, magistracies, the whole inherited apparatus of 500 years, while he held every lever that actually mattered. He gave them an enemy to hate. Antony, Cleopatra, the Parthians, always something external to absorb the city's anxiety. He gave them a narrative, Virgil's Golden Age, Horace's Odes of Gratitude, Livy's History of Rome as an arc bending toward this moment. He gave them grain and games and safe streets and temples restored to gods who seemed to be paying attention again. People will accept an enormous amount if it arrives wrapped in the right story. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later under emperors he despised, understood this with cold precision. The old Romans, he wrote, had gradually become enslaved under the name of peace. The enslavement was not brutal, it was almost comfortable. It came dressed in the language of restoration, tradition, service to the state. Most people, for most of the time, never noticed it happening at all, and the generation after them had no memory of anything else to compare it to. The lie had become the only reality they knew, not because they were deceived, because the performance had lasted long enough to become the world. Augustus never called himself emperor. He called himself first citizen, servant of Rome, the revered one, father of the fatherland. And every ruler who came after him, in Rome and in the long shadow Rome cast across 1,000 years of Western civilization, learned the same lesson he had written in the bones of an empire, that power claimed openly invites resistance. Power claimed in the name of service, tradition, and humility. Power that wraps itself in the forms of the institutions it has hollowed out. Power that never admits what it is. That is the power that lasts. That was the genius of it. And if that sounds familiar, if something in that description reminds you of a world you recognize, then perhaps the most important thing Augustus ever taught us is not about Rome at all.